And joining us now in our Brisbane studio is Trade Minister Craig Emerson. Thanks for being there.
That's fine, Tony.
Now, Kevin Rudd said today there is no way, in fact, he repeated it, no way that he would ever be party to a stealth attack on a sitting Prime Minister elected by the people. Do you accept that statement?
Well, that's pretty much what's been going on over the last 18 months.
Just quickly back to the question.
I didn't get to answer the question. I think I got about 7 words out.
Yeah, but the question is, do you accept the statement?
Well, he's made the statement, so I'm not sure what you mean, Tony. What I'm saying is that what's the proposition? I'm just not following your question because I can't get an answer out if we could start on the basis of me being able to say something rather than have 3 questions each time being interrupted. There has been an attack on the Prime Minister going back to the last election. There was destabilisation and leaking then. It's been going on since. I, for example, had a discussion with newspaper editors late last year who said, Craig, you know there will be a challenge by Kevin Rudd against Julia Gillard. That's when it started to intensify, and it's been going on since. So if we're talking about attacking sitting Prime Ministers and destabilisation, I think Kevin should look in his own backyard because this has been going on for too long. And I do welcome the fact that now it has come to a point where it's going to be resolved.
OK, well, your colleague Tony Burke tonight and now you are pretty much calling Kevin Rudd a liar because his basic fundamental statement is that he wouldn't take part in such a stealth attack.
That would mean to be calling journalists right across this country liars, because right across this country, journalists have been saying to me and to other members of Parliament that Kevin Rudd is seeking to regain the leadership, that he is destabilising, that there will be a challenge. I was even told that the challenge will occur in mid-March. Now, are the journalists fabricating this? I reckon that's a question for the journalist profession. On this occasion, I'm backing the journalists because I do not believe that journalists make those sorts of statements to a Labor minister on the basis of total fabrication. They are being told this, they have been told it for a long time, including in my case, before Christmas, and that the challenge would come in mid-March. Now, for Kevin then to say that this bickering and destabilisation must stop, well, there's a good idea. That's a great idea. He started it way back in the last election. It's been going on ever since, and now, at least, it's coming to a point of resolution. But I do note this, Tony, in looking at some of the online media coverage tonight, some backers of Kevin Rudd have said this will go on until they get Kevin back into the Prime Ministership. That won't happen, but what they are saying is that they would continue to destabilise if there were a ballot coming up early next week until they got their way. All they are doing is giving comfort to Tony Abbott and the Liberal Party, and they ought to reflect very seriously on that.
Kevin Rudd said the most important question for his caucus colleagues is who is best placed to defeat Tony Abbott at the next election. Briefly, what's your answer to that?
Julia Gillard is. The only alternative to Julia Gillard is Tony Abbott. And Julia Gillard has undertaken very bold reforms in the Labor reforming tradition. And one consequence of that, particularly in respect to putting a price on carbon, but also going ahead with the mining tax and other economic reforms, is that it does affect your standing in the polls. We understand that, but as Labor people, we don't then walk away from necessary reforms. That's what Labor people do. That's what Labor leaders do, and that's what Julia Gillard's doing because she's a very good Labor leader.
What happens on Monday if you start getting comparison polling from the major pollsters from Newspoll and Nielsen that says that Kevin Rudd is in a much better position to defeat Tony Abbott? If you get that sort of polling, what happens to the vote?
Well, you see, this is the very point. From my perspective, you do not govern by opinion polls. The Australian people expect better and deserve better. And you cannot implement reforms if every time you get up in the morning, you roll out of bed and you take an opinion poll on what you should do. You get elected to lead. That's what Julia Gillard is doing. She is leading, she is reforming to secure for this country a better future and a fairer future. That's really important. Now, if we're going to be in a world where we have an alternative leader looking at the polls, as I frankly have to say Kevin did, he walked away from putting a price on carbon. He became a poll-driven Prime Minister, and we saw the consequences of that. Julia Gillard is pressing ahead with essential Labor reforms that are absolutely important to the future of this country.
Okay,
the whole
I want to get on. I want to get on
and
and talk about what's actually happening. Have senior ministers in the cabinet?
We got off policy very quickly.
Have senior ministers in the cabinet? Well, we're about to have a leadership spill. We want to talk about that. Have senior ministers in the cabinet, as a matter of principle, decide that it's actually better to do badly in the polls, possibly even go to a defeat, than it is to go back to serving under Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister?
Now, senior ministers are interested in implementing the necessary reforms for this country. As you know, I used to work for Bob Hawke. We went through bad periods in polls. What did we do? Walk away from it? Say, oh, well, we better get ourselves another leader because as a result of floating the dollar, creating an open competitive economy, we're not doing too well in the polls, let's switch leaders. We're not going to go to the New South Wales formula, which has been tried and failed, of going through one leader, then another, and then back to another one or to a third one. There's only one alternative to Julia Gillard. That's Tony Abbott, and we should not be playing into his hands.
The reason I ask that question is because confronted with the prospect of Kevin Rudd challenging and becoming Prime Minister again, potentially, Tony Burke said tonight, and he spoke directly about the chaos under Kevin Rudd, about his temperament, about the inability to have decisions made. He challenged directly what Kevin Rudd was doing as Prime Minister. He undermined his previous Prime Minister.
Well, these things matter, don't they? I mean, whether you run an organised or a dysfunctional government. I was actually in the outer ministry, so I did not get to attend cabinet meetings to the extent that cabinet meetings were actually held under Kevin. I'm now in the cabinet, and cabinet meetings are held regularly under Julia Gillard because we have a cabinet government and proper process. Those processes did not exist or scarcely existed when Kevin was Prime Minister. And on the couple of occasions when I had issues to be brought before the Cabinet, I was flying around the country trying to chase what wasn't the Cabinet but a group of four called the Special Purpose Budget Committee or Cabinet Committee, SPBC, and frankly, I scarcely got into the room. So that was my experience in terms of the relationship or the operation of the Cabinet, of the government, when I was in the outer ministry. Now my experience that I'm in the Cabinet is that it meets regularly, it considers decisions, it makes decisions in the national interest, and under Julia Gillard, it has the guts, it has the courage to implement the necessary reforms for Australia's future.
OK, but this open warfare, this disparagement of a former Labor Prime Minister, indeed one that won an historic victory, is unprecedented. So what I'm wondering is, hearing this from senior ministers tonight, whether the decision has been made by the Prime Minister to put a stake through Kevin Rudd's heart so he never rises again.
Well, I think the reality is that if there is a ballot, a decisive result is the best way of putting this issue to rest, given that it's been going on for 18 months, intensified over the Christmas period into the new year. It is in the interests of the Labor Party, it's in the interests of the government, and it's in the national interest that this issue be resolved, and that through a decisive result we do not have a repetition of statements that are being made right now by supporters of Kevin Rudd that if they don't get their way, they're going to continue with the destabilisation program. Kevin's saying it must stop. Well, he can actually stop it. He can actually stop it. So let's stop it. Let's do the right thing by the Labor Party and the government and the country.
I've just got to ask you one last question. What do you think the voters are going to make of the fact that senior ministers, senior cabinet ministers, are taking Kevin Rudd's reputation apart tonight? What do you think voters who actually still like him are going to make of this?
Well, what I'm saying is that we need a decisive result, and if that means explaining how things operated under Kevin, what would be in prospect if theoretically there were a return of Kevin to the leadership, I think that's something that is necessary. I don't take any pleasure out of it. It doesn't make me feel great, but there is a lot at stake here. And so what we need to do is make sure that there is very strong support for Prime Minister Gillard as a reforming Prime Minister, because that's in the national interest.
Craig Emerson, we'll leave you there. We thank you very much for coming in to join us tonight.
Thank you, Tony.